This is Sean. We're doing a podcast for Element Rescue today on some Outlier skills to improve morbidity and mortality during active shooter events. We took a while to kind of scrub this PowerPoint out. There's quite a bit of things that we didn't want to probably put for public consumption out there. We're going to take a look at some of the outlier skill sets that are often overlooked that directly correlate to decreasing mortality in active shooter events. This will be actually a 3-part series. This will be part 1. Part 1 will pretty much be examining the need for looking at alternative methods and skill sets to accomplish the mission of decreasing mortality and being able to bring an end to one of these type of events. Part 2 is going to look at applying some of these skill sets into the operational situations. And part 3 will be really kind of digging into the history, need, physics, and anatomy of the Halligan tool, almost in a biblical fashion. For those that have seen us give this presentation, this is going to look quite a bit different due to it being put out on the internet. We spent quite a few hours with a bunch of us taking a look at this thing and scrubbing out a lot of the items that we usually give into this program of instruction. Usually when we give this, it's in a closed setting, usually for law enforcement officers viewing. So a lot of the potential insights and diving deep into some of the AARs of some of the events that we're going to talk to have been taken out. For those people that have questions that feel like any of that information will be valuable for them, if they're giving it to their departments or anything like that, just hit us up on email and we'll talk to you probably over the phone on some of those events and get you what you need and get you those kind of insider details. So this is not going to be as in-depth as we usually go. We're not going to hit on a lot of the surrounding details of a lot of these incidents, but rather focus on the actual requirement for the outlier skill sets that we're going to identify, give the listener a little bit of the background needed, probably just enough to be able to make an argument for potentially evolving some of their TTPs and evolve some of the concepts that surround these events. So when we look at response to IED, active shooter incidents, there's a lot of hot topics out there, one being Rescue Task Force. The IAFF obviously put out a position paper last year on that, on not only the inclusion of firefighters participating in active shooter mass casualty events to include IEDs. The U.S. Fire Administration also put out a document there. You kind of see it listed off the right side of the screen there. That kind of goes hand in hand with warm zone medicine. As far as the Rescue Task Force thing, we're going to be doing a podcast with some folks that have initiated these just to kind of show some different thought patterns based on your organic assets of your municipality, county, or city that you work within and ways that you can kind of manipulate that RTF to fit your requirements and kind of think outside the box a little bit as far as that's concerned. But the IFF did put a great position paper out endorsing the use of Rescue Task Force, also endorsing the utilization of tactical emergency casualty care as the treatment modality during those type of events. Warm zone venison, very similar. So for those that don't know that, it's basically the ability for law enforcement to be able to get in there, either isolate or eliminate that threat, be able to cordon certain parts of that building, creating casualty collection points, being able to rapidly move small elements of a rescue task force in there with the main priority of doing kind of a rapid triage, rapid treatment for essential life-saving treatment modalities, and then rapidly evacuating those casualties out, getting them to a higher echelon of care. FEMA and DHS has recently put out a paper that you may have heard of. I guess that was probably last week, called the First Responder Guide for Improving Survivability in Improvised Explosive Devices and Active Shooter Incidents. Even prior to that, they put out some good guidelines and papers for first responders out there. FEMA DHS has some grants going out that you potentially can look into through UASC and Homeland Security type of people that may work in your departments. They also have the ability of contacting them and getting what's called a TA, or a technical assistance program, out to your city free of charge, where you can get people that are committee members for TECC and to go out there and brief you on those capabilities and how to set up your own regional training facility for your own personnel. So there's a lot of grants, working groups, TAs that are out there. There's also a working group that consisted of many of us out there that was part of putting this last paper together that just recently got published. When we look at this is usually the tipping point of the presentation, that when we're addressing a lot of times law enforcement, sometimes fire administrators, those people that are in charge of the money, in charge of training that you're going to be doing, how that time and money gets allocated. This is kind of what we start that brief on, which wins us typically a lot of enemies and losing friends very rapidly. But we all get to a point where we have a group hug towards the end when they understand what the point is that we're trying to make. And many times we say that when you get into those administrative levels, it becomes almost a political type deal, and sometimes those administrators lose touch with what's really going on. So when we look at those things, are we really students of the game? A lot of people with the feet on the ground many times are, right? They have a vested interest in that because they're going to be the ones going first through the door, having to come up with schedules for monthly training. But one of those questions that we typically throw out just to kind of see what the operational gap analysis is out there as far as understanding is where do we get our information from and what do we believe really occurred at these events that all of us kind of throw out there when we're talking or give examples in our presentations of. But when we dig down to the minutia of these events, that's where there's a lot of information that's often overlooked that ends up being extremely critical to not only develop how we train, but also how we allocate money and what we actually train on. So when we look at that, a lot of times we'll start that out by asking a large group of administrators questions like, we're all familiar with the 1999 event of Columbine, which greatly shifted the way in which we respond to the active shooter event. And with that, how many people out there usually isn't a whole bunch, realize that at no point did Harrison-Klebold actually really intend on going into that school and shooting kids, that they actually based the majority of their TTPs for that assault on an event that happened in 1927 in Bath, Michigan, involving a guy named Kehoe who attacked a school to the point where, and you can pull this up yourself on the internet, there's about 964 pages of handwritten notes that Harrison-Klebold scribed that you can pull through, and after a lot of coffee and potentially some Adderall, make your way through that and gain a lot of insight onto how they were planning that attack, what they were planning on doing. Yet, coast to coast, we can still go out and find departments training force on force to an active shooter event where there's 2 kids in a school. One's potentially wearing a trench coat, randomly going around shooting kids with a kind of a coup de grace that ends up in the library, when in reality that was never their intent. And a lot of people out there, a lot of kids out there actually know what their intent was because they studied them. The problem is for us, most of our administrators, most of us aren't actually sociopaths that dig down into the minutia of these events to find out what was really going on, what was their mindset, who were they copying, how were they evolving off of other incidents. Yet we can ask our chiefs some questions about, who are the last 10 quarterbacks for Notre Dame, and they're able to give us their names and probably their quarterback rating. They can tell us all these things that are relevant to the job, but that's actually their passion. The problem is the opponents that you will face in active shooter events, their passion is going in and devastating and murdering people, and that is actually how we have to study these events, is as if we were that sociopath looking at the minutia of what they would look at those key performance parameters that occurred in these events. And out of that, we're probably going to glean quite a bit of gaps that currently exist in our current TTPs, to the point where we could almost compare our local high school football coach down the road and make the statement that he is probably more prepared to face his next opponent than many of our organizations are, for the simple fact that you can go up to him on a Monday to find out who he's playing on Friday, and he'll be able to tell you what kind of defense their opponent's going to be. Is it a nickel? Is it a dime? What do they typically do on 3rd and long, 4th and short? How many step backs, a 3-step, 5-step back that their quarterbacks take. Yet when we ask him questions about, hey, when we look at Virginia Tech, what was Cho's firing rate while he was in Norris Hall compared to what it was when he was in a classroom? Out of all 51 students that he shot, those that lived and those that died, how many rounds did he, on average, put into each one? What was the breach time at Virginia Tech? And we will typically find crickets at that point without any answers. When in reality, if we're creating TTPs to template operational success, those are questions we have to ask, and we actually have to have the answers to, and those are the things that we need to dig into. Unfortunately, most of our information that we get is not vetted. It's on 24-hour news cycles, and we're tied to that TV when this event's going on. And obviously, as most of you know, that first 24 hours of news coverage usually is permeated with speculation and things that end up being not actually what occurred. And in hopes of being the first ones to report X, Y, or Z, it gets thrown out there, and all of a sudden in our psyche that becomes truth. and we start training for that, and we're training for an event that actually didn't occur, which is very, very problematic. So when we're thinking about how we form our TTPs, we need to realize, is it evidence-based, is it capability-based, and is that information that we're building these things off actually vetted? So for us today, as a status check in TECC, we typically throw casualty management into 4 parameters, which is usually an access issue, an assess issue, a stabilize issue, and then an extract and evac issue. All those principles and your capabilities and skill sets that you bring into that operation are built on a PACE methodology. We have a primary, an alternate, a contingency, and an emergency. If we're building in, from breaching to hemorrhage control to you name it, we build that into a PACE methodology. So just to throw out an example here, hemorrhage control, we needed to build hemorrhage control into a PACE methodology. That primary may be using an aftermarket tourniquet, such as a soft T W or a CAT tourniquet. Being the average patrol officer, we may not be carrying more than, let's say, 1 or 2 of those tourniquets, and we blow through those on casualties that we encounter. Moving very smoothly from one to another, alternate. Now, what do we have available? That alternate may be, we may have a ACE bandage or an ETD or something like that that's still available in our IFAC, and we may put that on, and we may try and apply a windlass in there, and we may try and do a quick improv type tourniquet with the kit that we still have available to us. If we don't have that, we move into that contingency. That contingency may be looking around that room, finding that necktie or cutting that long sleeve off of somebody's jacket and being able to wrap that around their leg, looking for a windlass. We break that frame that's on the wall and break one of the wood pieces off there, use that as a windlass, and we need something to secure that windlass when it's under tension, so we may grab our watch off and put that underneath there so it can hold that tension windlass in place to be able to improvise that. And then emergency is we really don't have anything. We're in a place that we have no improv capabilities, and we may just be putting a knee or an elbow proximal to where that bleeding is and cranking down on that and holding security until somebody with a piece of kit or a piece of medical kit comes around that we're able to use. So that's kind of PACE in a very general concept. When we look at what we're looking at today as far as assess, stabilize, and evacuation, the assess and stabilize, we'll talk about real briefly. That's mainly the brunt is TECC type of treatment modalities. Our access issues are something that we typically find lacking in most guidelines that get put out there. Access is usually always a problem. That access could be area denial because of a threat. That access could be Virginia Tech with chains on the doors. That access could be on a vehicle accident where we can't get into that casualty because of vehicular damage or rollover or something like that. So access is something that's got to stay in the front of our brains all the time. Unfortunately, it's not something that we drill into the psyche of our patrol officers. There's not a lot of departments out there teaching hasty active shooter breaching nationwide out there. And even if we go into SWAT teams, which many of us currently work on or have worked on before, it is one of those things that even on a SWAT team, we have a couple guys that do the breaching typically for us, right? It's usually the bigger Mongo, hits ram really hard type of guy, and the rest of the team is not that skilled at doing that. And we'll take a look at that probably later on in one of these parts. But access is huge, and we always need to keep that in our forefront. There's committees out there that, and I don't want to badmouth any committees that are out there that are made up of people that may not bring inclusion of other specialties into that when they create their statements of work or their call to actions. Usually we find very interesting with acronyms that are very, very catchy, and those acronyms permeate down into everybody's verbiage when we're training. And there's one out there, and this is not bagging whatsoever on there, but this is just kind of giving an example that we always need to check the facts before we get into implementing certain TTPs. And one of those things that are out there, which has permeated out there, which is great because the majority of it's very, very effective, is an acronym like THREAT. And when we look at that, everybody's like, yes, threat. That's our call to action. So we have threat and elimination, we have hemorrhage control, we have rapid evacuation, blah, 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 blah. The problem with that is when we compare that into our modern day issues that we run into, threat's great, man, right? With threat, that needs to be the top priority, is to eliminate that threat, and that's the T on the threat. The problem with that is if we go back and review AARs of several active shooter events that have occurred in the past decade, we're going to find that a lot of times our threat is starting to fortify, and we're going to get more into that in a couple slides from now. But they're fortifying that. This organization is comprised completely, except I think of one person, of very, very intelligent medical physicians, right? Physicians. When in reality, if we maybe throw in a law enforcement guy or we throw in a firefighter, it's going to give them a little bit different perspective. So, I think one of the things that's really lacking on that threat is the reliance of an acronym of what we're going to do. Acronyms don't save lives. I think acronyms are very effective in certain areas. The MARCH acronym, right? It's one of those things when we get all messed up doing patient care and we've got patients all over. I can go back to MARCH if I'm getting confused in patient care and be like, okay, that's massive hemorrhage, right? Do I have that controlled? Yes, no. Airway, how are we looking at airway? Respiration, circulatory. Great, that acronym helps out under those stressful situations. Whereas with threat, right, we have threat elimination. Roger that. Problem with threat elimination and making statements that no one should die of lack of hemorrhage control, of bleeding out in these events. You're absolutely right. They absolutely shouldn't die. The problem is no patrol officer should approach a door at a school, whether it's Platte Canyon, Nickel Mines, or Virginia Tech, all of which occurred in 6 months, all fortified, and not have the training and capability to be able to effectively breach into that very rapidly. So as you're stuck outside that door, as was the case in Virginia Tech, you could have all the cool tourniquets. You could have your gun zeroed in and ready to roll. And if you're not getting in there and you're sitting there listening to gunshots going off and kids screaming and kids dying, that's a big problem. So we're almost kind of getting our cart in front of the horse there, to where we need to ingrain into every first responder that there's a very good chance that thing is fortified. If we get to doors and they're not fortified, we should be really, really happy. And if we look at the current stats that are out there as far as lockdown procedures that have gone over the past decade, the last report I think ended in 2013, and there was close to 80% of the schools that's doors naturally locked. So with that, you're running into a case where there's an extremely good chance no matter what you do as far as your response going into a school, you're going to have to breach. Patrol will have to breach. The other problem with that is, I guess it was about 4 years ago when you look at national lockdown procedures, a couple of things came out, and one of those, there's a disconnect between law enforcement and between the national schools procedures, and realize schools don't have to follow the procedures that are recommended at a national level. Many of them do. Many of them add their own capabilities in there depending on what their building construction and things like that are. But if you look at that, what came down the road about 3 or 4 years ago was that when a lockdown is called, those teachers look out their hallway for any students that are out there, grab who's ever in there, bring them into your room, and lock down. The second part of that is maintenance folks, based on what they feel their level of safety is, are supposed to go around if their doors don't automatically lock and lock them. And a lot of people call kind of BS on that, like that is ridiculous. But what we have to realize is typically there's two types of lockdown. There's a lockdown because something's going on in the area of that school, and there's a lockdown because there's an intruder in that school. There's still a lot of schools out there that do not differentiate between the two, or that gets mixed up when that code gets called. Or it's a dynamic situation where something happened and somebody is able to move into that school. That being said, that is the reason that the maintenance people have a responsibility to go around and lock those doors. So realize that without a breaching capability, this is really, really problematic, and we've seen that quite a few times. So access is a huge deal. Remember to breach. And instead of remembering an acronym, just think. It's more important probably to teach our officers, our first responders, our firemen, our EMS people, how to think instead of what to think. Because when we have the variable of a threat in there, we can't call Dionne Warwick's psychic hotline and figure out what's going on in their head as we're responding in a 2 to 3 minute time period and get things going. So, if we put that threat into a situation, what Columbine was supposed to be with explosives and them going around on the outside shooting teachers and kids after the fire alarms were pulled and they were coming out, we would have a very difficult time, because that threat elimination is very problematic. Because although we may be able to eliminate the threats that are actually shooting kids What about the threats that potential explosives that are still there? If we put that into Boston, what does that look like? So if we're putting that threat elimination in there, being able to complete that before we do hemorrhage control, those people that are bleeding may be waiting for a while. There's certain things in this dynamic situation that have to be done at the same time. We can't think about it in a logarithmic step-by-step type of thing. We actually have to use our brains and knock out what has to be done. So I would definitely try not to get wrapped up in an overabundance of acronyms that you use as your guide to do that. The other side of it is, if we're going by threat and we're looking at threat elimination, we're looking at hemorrhage control, then we're looking at rapid evacuation. There's going to be times where that casualty is going to be out in the open, where you're not going to want to stop and put a tourniquet or put a hemostatic on that casualty in the middle of the hallway. You're going to want to rapidly evacuate them before you do your hemorrhage control. So, with that, it requires you to think. So don't get caught up in that, and don't get caught up in specific acronyms. We can come up with a million of them, and now because we figured out we need to be able to breach first, we could come up with, our breach, unabated, threat termination, hemorrhage control, offset CCPs, lower vertical casualty capabilities, evacuation to higher tiered echelons of care, and bam, we got our new acronym. It's called Butthole. That's going to be patented and trademarked, so don't use that. That was obviously a sarcastic comment, but point being is, think about it, right? We got access problems. Just keep that in mind. We got to get in. We got to find that threat, move to the sound of the gun. Simultaneously, as we're going, we may see kids that have snoring respirations that somebody behind us can throw on their side because they can't maintain their own airway. And within 2 seconds, you just help that person out as you continue moving on. There's things that may have to be done simultaneously, so we need to keep that in mind. So let's move on off that point. All right, so when we look at emerging medical and rescue gaps, the ones that we find from one coast to another, is there's a huge information permeation problem. What really went on in these events? How is that data correlated, and how is that permeated down to the line guys, like patrol officers, like your guys who are riding backwards on fire engines, the paramedic and EMTs and the ambulances, and it doesn't get out there, which is very problematic. Improvisation is a huge deal. If you heard our podcast on TECC, you heard us talking with Dave Calloway and Brendan Hartford on that one. Improv is the key to success on that. No one is going to bring enough kit into the fight to be able to manage that. So being able to not be the deer in the headlights and being able to effectively have trained and practiced and put science behind your improvisational techniques, from cutting carpet around somebody and using that as a soft litter for evac, from being able to improvise your tourniquets, improvise packing, being able to improvise something for a sucking chest wound. Huge capability that is very underutilized and undertaught and not really put into an enormous amount of the guidelines out there. Breaching, we're going to kill this dead horse on this 3-part series. Just know breaching is a large operational gap, and we really need to think about smarter ways potentially to breach just with one man, right? One man capability, which was the case, is door after door after door was found chained at Virginia Tech, and it becomes a race of who can get in there quick to be able to reach that threat. High angle and hasty, that is getting into a little bit more for your rescue task force, even for your law enforcement that don't have the ability to augment their evacuation and CCP management with rescue task force. It's easy. It's fast. It's about a 30-minute class to be able to do it very, very safe. Don't complicate yourself with a bunch of different knots and a bunch of different anchors and this and that. Moving mass with a rope system, being able to manipulate areas of friction to take the weight off the anchor, which may be you, very, very easy to do. I would think rapid intervention team type concepts for that. For rescue task force out there in the fire department, we're going to do a podcast probably in the near future on RTFs where we'll get more into it. But if you think vent inner search, which is very common for those firefighters out there, and if you think about being able to take a security posture from law enforcement, which may be 1 or 2 patrol officers, and be able to effect surgical type rescues where you're not going in the main breach point and going through the halls and up the stairwell, where all the patrol officers and people inside are going to have to cordon an area to be able to escort you up there and then be able to get into that room that's your CCP and get casualties moved and rapidly triage, rapidly treat, package them, and get them out on litters or SCEDCOs and things like that. When you think vent-under search, that may be something that is fast, realistic. It may take a lot of the financial requirements of body armor away just by changing the scope into something that firemen do on a daily basis and train on. And it's very quick when we transpose those capabilities into kind of the vent-under search type of methodology. We're going to get into some CCP stuff here in a little bit. Evac removal from CCPs, definitely think nonlinear, think windows. Why go out the same hallways where people are still trying to do secondary clears, may run into threat discrimination issues with the new patrol guy who just got cleared to ride by himself yesterday. Why are we adding chaos into an already chaotic environment? As far as standards to follow, if you're a fire department person, these NFPA things ring true and usually create a slight amount of nausea and vomiting when thinking about. When you look at that, NFPA 1006, I think, stands out 1407 to an extent. You are under no reason whatsoever to follow 1983, right? So at no point, if you're a rescue task force, should you be bringing half-inch rope, steel carabiners, and that type of crap into that environment. It's heavy, it's bulky, it doesn't belong there, right? Is that what you're doing for rapid intervention team stuff? Is that how we're rescuing? Absolutely not. And in 1407, what kind of guideline structure do you have to follow? Not very much. NFPA purposely did not put handcuffs on you because you are in extremis at that point, trying to rescue your own. In this event, why 1983 doesn't matter is if we look at 1983 and the scope of 1983, it used to be 1.1.5, and I think now it's 1.1.6. And in the scope, it says, hey, listen, if you are part of a mountain rescue team or this team or that team or a team that potentially is exposed to other dangers, please do not follow these guidelines. I would say in this event, you do not need to follow these guidelines. If you're getting a lightweight aluminum carabiner that's rated at 23 kilonewtons, right, 1 kilonewton being 224.8 pounds, and you've got a 23 kilonewton carabiner and a bailout rope and a 7.5 or 8 millimeter bailout rope, especially if it's aramid, you're looking at about a 4,000 to 5,000 pound rating on your rope. Because I'm a product of Southern Education, you can multiply 225 by 23 for your carabiner strength. I think you're good. I think you're definitely good. Maybe a piece of webbing, and you should be able to rock that thing out. And as far as authority having jurisdiction, that is the key component. If you look at NFPA 1006 for any of those standards, but we'll just look at ropes since it's relevant to our conversation here. At no point when you read the job performance requirements of NFPA 1006 does it state your technique to use or the equipment to use. And that's where people get hung up thinking 1983 has to permeate into 1006 and blah, blah, blah. That's up to the authority having jurisdiction, and you are the authority having jurisdiction. Your department, your individual county, however you have it worked out, is the authority having jurisdiction who can state what the safety factor is, what equipment you're going to use, and what technique you're going to use. That is not dictated at all by NFPA on there, and they purposely don't, because you may be working in a mountain environment. You may be working in whatever environment. Every department's different from coast to coast with different budgets, different personnel assets, things like that. So realize that NFPA is not a constricting factor if you read into it and understand what it means. Structural collapse, hasty, confined space. Another gap. Why is this a gap? It could be a gap for a couple reasons. One is if Columbine went down the way that they planned it to, and if you get an opportunity to read their 964 pages of handwritten notes, I would encourage you to. Those 2 bombs, and we'll talk about this here in a second, those bombs that went off were supposed to go off in the cafeteria. If this went down the way it was supposed to, most law enforcement agencies, including fire department, would probably have to have some sort of hasty confined space, hasty structural collapse rescue during dynamic events, training every year, every 2 years. Didn't happen, so we kind of sweep it under the rug and just kind of go upon our merry way. When we look at those standards, if we look at NFPA for those type of things, our operational constraints will dictate we do things different, right? It's not going to be a technical rescue team rolling in there with shoring and struts and airbags and etc. It's going to be making things happen very, very quick, potentially using parts of the building as levers and fulcrums, grabbing what you can and doing it. But in the end, a lot of the principles that exist within NFPA 1006 and what we already know through common sense, the principles stay the same. The practices differ. You lift an inch, crib an inch, right? That cribbing may end up being natural cribbing, which is parts of the building that collapse. So as I'm lifting up on a class 2 lever to try and get somebody who's partially stuck under there, his legs are stuck under a concrete block or an exterior wall or something like that, as we're lifting, you'll be cribbing. We'll be doing a 360 around there. We're going to crib where we can right off the bat. We know that everything has an equal and opposite reaction, so we're going to be looking for what's happening when I'm doing a class 1 versus a class 2 lever, etc. So when we look at that, we can still follow those standards. It's just going to be a little bit more austere, if you will. And we need to look at those organic assets that we have available. So it definitely looks a little bit different, but in the end, the principles of it are what you do every single day. So for today, what we're going to do is look at a couple events. Going down that list, we'll take a quick look at Columbine, a quick look at Platte Canyon, nickel mines, and Virginia Tech. And then we're going to take a break for part 1. We don't think we're going to probably have time for Moscow Theater, Beslan, Mumbai, and Boston, but you'll definitely see how it will apply to those if you're familiar with the AARs from those events. For those events, we are not going to go into a lot of the background irrelevant details that we would if we were looking at a holistic full spectrum type of response. But what you want to look at it through the eyes of law enforcement, fire, EMS, how those things work. Going back to a lot of the guideline committees or a lot of the groups, the working groups that get put together, they are usually very heavy on medical personnel, whether that is typically physicians with the inclusion of maybe medics and etc., which is great, right? Because we're talking about how can we decrease morbidity, mortality, what treatment modalities need to go into that. But I think what we'll find is when we dig through this, it needs to be a very holistic approach to how we look at that. Law enforcement officer who is trained as a first responder is going to see that incident a little bit different, with an emphasis on other aspects that the medical professional may not see. So in that same thing, if you're a hammer, usually all you see are nails. And if you are a high-end healthcare professional, you may miss the minutiae of important skill sets that exist. And I think we'll kind of touch on that here.